Keep on riding with us as we continue to broadcast the balance and defend the discourse from the Hip Hop Weekly studios. Welcome back to Civic Cypher. I'm still your host, Ramses Ja. And for those that don't know, Q Ward will return soon, but he is in the great state of Michigan taking care of his mother. So please keep his family in your thoughts and prayers. But in the meantime, in between time, we have the great Dr. Christopher Towler with us. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Sacramento. He's also the director of the Black Voter Project, co-founder of Black Insights Research, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, and the author of the Newsweek article, From Decline to Revival, Why Democrats Must Repair the Relationship with Black Voters. And we are having a conversation about that very article. So be sure to stick around for the second part of this conversation. But before we get there, it is time to discuss BABA, Becoming a Better Ally Baba. And today's Baba, I want to share a story about two pastors that were arrested for protesting the removal of a black mural in Florida. So this from the Black Information Network. Two Florida pastors were arrested after peacefully protesting the removal of a Black History Matter street in St. Petersburg, street mural. According to Fox 13 Tampa Bay, Reverend Andrew Oliver of Allendale United Methodist Church and Reverend Benedict Aherton Zeman of Unitarian Universalist Church of St. Petersburg were arrested after sitting directly on the mural to block Florida Department of Transportation workers from painting over it. Police said both men were repeatedly warned to move before being arrested and charged with pedestrian obstruction and hindering traffic. The protest came after Senate Bill 1662 was signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis in June, prohibiting any form of political expression, including street murals, on state-controlled transportation facilities. Critics say the law is part of a broader effort by DeSantis and Republican allies to target expressions of diversity and inclusion. Quote, "Let's be honest, we all know that this is not about traffic safety, this is political. It's part of the same culture war climate where symbols of inclusion are targeted precisely because they represent acceptance. It's about erasing the visibility of the LGBTQIA+ people." This according to Delray Beach Vice Mayor Rob Long. The city of St. Petersburg pushed back against the effort, requesting exemptions for several murals, including Prime-themed and campus artwork. Officials also cited traffic crash data showing no safety issues tied to the murals. Still, FDOT denied the request and moved forward with the erasure. St. Petersburg Mayor Ken Welch released a statement last week in response to the situation. Quote, "These murals are more than paint on pavement. They are expressions of our community, identity, and values. As mayor of our city, I will not risk these essential investments in a fight I don't believe we can win. But make no mistake, this is not the end of the story. Our response will be strategic, not reactionary." This, according to Mayor Welch. Shout out to the two pastors that put their bodies on the line to protest what they believe is right. That is indeed true allyship, and we celebrate that around here. Okay, Dr. Towler. Now, in the first part of the show, you discussed something, and this is my mistake because I shouldn't have assumed that everyone knows what you meant. I have the privilege of knowing you outside of, this show. So you've taught me quite a bit. But talk to our listeners a bit about high propensity voters and low propensity voters and what that means, because I think that the conversation registers a little bit better once people understand what those terms actually entail.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about voters, especially Black voters, most of the time it's just talked about in general as a group of people that need to get out to the polls to vote. However, deeper analyses tend to look at different types of Black voters. Mm-hmm. And so we've really tried to impression upon sort of the mainstream media and anyone we talk to that there are voters who get out and vote all the time, who are likely to vote in every single election. And they typically have a certain profile. They're more educated, more economically well off, older, right? Oftentimes live in urban communities. And so this group of voters is what we would call high propensity voters, or sort of frequent voters or super voters, people that are going to vote most of the time, have voted most of their lives. You don't necessarily have to look at them and say, are they going to vote, right? On the other hand, there are a large group of voters, in some estimates, 40% of the Black population, that are lower propensity voters. And these are voters who might vote once in a while, or maybe have voted in one election in the last couple of cycles, but do not vote all the time, do not really pay attention to politics in the same way that the other group does. And they have a different profile, right? Oftentimes less educated, less economically affluent, might live in more rural areas in different parts of the country. Those low propensity voters, to us, are the ones who we need to be paying attention to, especially in these since Obama left office, because what we saw is that during President Obama's tenure in those elections, 2008 and 2012, both high and low propensity voters came out to vote at historic rates. They wanted to see the first Black president not just win, but win a second term and serve 8 full years in the White House. And so under that guise, we saw the Democratic Party win elections that they probably wouldn't have won as easily without Black turnout being extremely high. And so we saw for the first time in 2012, Black turnout actually surpassed white turnout in a national election, right? That's the first time in history that it's happened, and it hasn't happened since. And that can be mostly attributed to low propensity voters coming out at rates, very much more closer to these high propensity voters. But then after Obama leaves office or left office, we saw a lot of these low propensity infrequent voters go back to not really paying attention to politics, not really voting all the time or frequently like their high propensity counterparts. And so in the Newsweek piece, we start to discuss this in our analysis and say, you have to start to look at these two different groups of voters separately and distinctly to really understand what types of messaging and what types of campaign strategies need to be put in place to win elections and to get Black voters to the polls to help turn the tide.
Yeah. So now that is identified, we know the difference between high propensity and low propensity voters and the roles that each plays. I guess there's a little bit more clarity in looking back on the 2024 election and the messaging, because again, you mentioned this in the first part of the show, sending the messaging to the voters that already know and that are engaged doesn't necessarily move the needle with people who are not privy to that information, and it's not a part of their lives. Many people, as we've established on the show many times, they wake up in the morning and they go to work, and then they get their kids from daycare or pick them up from the babysitter, and then they go home, and then they have to make dinner, and after they make dinner, they go to their second job, and that's their life cycle. You know what I mean? And they're trying to survive, and they're trying to get as much money as they can to change their material reality. So when it comes to politics, it may as well be Pokemon cards. It's just not a thing for them. And so in looking back on where, Democrats went wrong in the 2024 election, trusting that people would show up just because Kamala Harris was Black, that was putting a lot of faith and I believe also taking advantage of and assuming that Black people only show up for race and not because a person really represents a fundamental change for their lifestyle. Now, Democrats, having learned that lesson, I think might adopt a different strategy going into midterms. So my question to you is, again, as a great political mind, can you say with more certainty what Democrats should be prioritizing ahead of the midterm elections, not just with respect to low propensity voters, but in general? Do you have any thoughts that you think would move the needle for Democrats in this country?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, Democrats need to find ways to invest in Black voters early, right? And often, like, start now. Try to find resources and funding to get out the vote campaigns where you have people in Black communities, especially in districts in states where you have contested midterm elections, right? Where you either have sort of a governor election or a Senate or a House election that black voters can make a difference in, right? Have people out in those communities talking to voters, impressioning upon them the importance of their vote as soon as possible, right? And that takes money, that takes resources, and that's one reason why we often don't see it as much as it needs to be done, because the resources are, hard to come by. And most campaigns, most political democratic establishments have finite resources. But if I could push them to do anything, it would be to get out there and use as much resources as possible in black communities early and often, right? When it comes to actual messaging, right? Again, all of the work I've done for the last 7 to 8 years, ever since sort of Trump's first term, going into the 2018 midterms and looking at 2020, suggests that black voters will be most convinced to vote if they understand the current threat, what's right in their face.
Okay.
When it comes to Trump and MAGA, when impressioning upon them the importance of their vote in right now protecting the gains that have been made over the last 50 to 60 years, really since the civil rights movement, right? The generational gains and progress the black community has seen, because it's clear, if you have even a short conversation about this with anyone, that the MAGA Make America Great Again movement, the again part is harkening back to a time period where black people had less rights, where black people had less freedoms, where it was harder to vote, and where the black community was less well off than it is today, right? Even though, as we've talked about, many people don't necessarily feel like their lives are that great today, right? There's a lot of struggle going on. It can always get worse, right? And I think those are the arguments that need to be made when talking to people with an understanding that it's right in our face now, right? This is the time to take action if there ever was time. And these midterm elections are not just one way to necessarily move towards change for the future, but to stop what's taking place right now, right? If you don't like troops being sent into black cities, this is an opportunity to vote to try and change that. Mm-hmm. If you don't like a lot of the gutting of DEI policy, funding being taken from black colleges and universities across the country, that your vote can change that right now, right? There's attacks on the black community coming from the Trump administration, the MAGA movement, that can be stopped. And at least there can be some sense of opposition if Democrats, succeed and win back offices either in the House or the Senate in the midterm elections.
I love that. Okay. So there's another, I guess, wrench in the mix here. Give us your thoughts on Zohran Mamdani in New York City. Do you feel like there might be a concern that black voters might be interested in maybe democratic socialism over the traditional Democratic Party? Because based on what I've seen, obviously the numbers don't support that, but there's been some trends that movement, the Democratic Socialist of America, is growing. And it's fueled particularly by people of color. Do you think that, well, really just give us your thoughts on that whole movement, because I know it's hard to predict. It's kind of still early, but that's not nothing. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think one thing's for certain, the New York mayor's race has become a sort of national spectacle, because both parties are trying to use it as a symbol for what could be or could not be for the future of American politics, right? And so there's been some embrace of the race and progressive policies there if they think it can be beneficial to the Democrats, but there's also been some sort of highlighting how these policies move away from what you might consider traditional politics from the Republicans if they feel like it can hurt the Democrats in the future. And so that mayoral race is getting a lot of attention, even though it's not necessarily going to affect national politics in the way that people might say it will, right? I think that it's still going to be very contained to New York City and New York State and not change too much outside of there. When it comes to sort of this idea of democratic socialism, there's always been a sort of interest within the black community for a third party, a party that is not necessarily attached to Democrats or Republicans, a party that can serve the interests of those who are not in the sort of political elite, because there's also a sense as we just talked about, right? That not just Republicans, but Democrats are not paying attention to the majority of black voters unless they need something from them, such as their vote, right? And so even in our surveys over the last election cycle, there's, a need 30 to 40% of black people consistently say, yeah, we're interested in a third party. We'd love to have a third option out there. Democratic socialism, though, in practice, at least over the last decade, has struggled to capture black voters because there's been a disconnect from the political elite pushing the movement and the black community. And a focus on economics is great, but black people also understand that there is racism baked into our economic system. And a focus just on economics without a mention of how racism within economics, whether it's institutional or individual racism, will be dealt with, right, leads to some of the same problems that black people live through in almost any other section of society beyond economics, right? This idea that, great, you can have an economic policy, but that economic policy could also be racist and just benefit certain people over others. And this has come up time and again when we've done analyses of sort of Bernie Sanders and the lack of black support for Sanders has come down to this idea that he talks a lot about economics and economic policies that are popular with the black community. But when talked about how those economic policies will make sure that they are not just benefiting white people or they're not leaving black people behind, there's again sort of this lack of conversation or lack of trust in the system, the party, the ideas from the black community, because they don't want to see the same thing happen with those policies that happens with everything else.
Sure. Where
it turns into a great policy, but in practice, in operation, black people still get the short end of the stick.
Yeah. Okay. So before we, I know we're close to the end here, but I want to circle back because we had a conversation earlier about the way that Democrats have been branded by this current administration as do-nothing Democrats. What are your thoughts on that label, especially given the fact that Donald Trump has been able to, maybe not legally, maybe not through traditional and expected channels, but he has been successful at really shifting the culture in this country in short order, where Democrats have historically succumbed to legislative roadblocks and the like. This term "do nothing Democrats," I feel like that is very harmful for people who espouse a progressive agenda. But do you think that it has some basis in the real world or not? And if so, do you think that Democrats are getting a crash course in what can be done given this current administration's trajectory?
I hope that would be the case. We're kind of seeing that in the redistricting battle that's taking place.
Yes. Okay, there we go.
Are really trying to find ways to fight back, and ways to fight back that are, voters recognize as fighting rather than just another sort of wordplay and talk, right? They're actually trying to put some money where their mouth is this time. So hopefully they're learning. I think the Democrats face a major challenge here in that for so long, they've ridden on the back of civil rights gains and the civil rights movement when it comes to black support, with an understanding that Democrats pushed forward through segregation, right? The undoing of Jim Crow, the institution of the Voting Rights Act, the expansion of the franchise. All of this are things that for decades, the Democrats had relied upon to win black support, to gain black support. However, a lot of that civil rights policy did not change the actual material status of the black community, right? The black community still, there's still major gaps, if not growing gaps, when it comes to family income, when it comes to the black versus white wealth and employment, home ownership. These gaps have not closed much, if at all, since the 1960s and 70s. And so Democrats now are having to explain for that, right? The civil rights gains of the past are now really in the past. And there's especially a new generation of black voters coming of age who are looking at their lives and being like, okay, yeah, I understand we're not segregated anymore, but I'm still having a hard time paying my rent. I'm still having a hard time not living month to month, check to check. What can be done now? Like, we need to address some of these actual material gains or lack thereof, and really invest in policy that is redistributing resources and bringing resources to the Black community in ways that now, address these gaps that have existed and haven't closed since the 1960s and 70s. There's sort of this second half of the civil rights movement, these gains now when it comes to poverty levels, when it comes to employment, that there needs to be real solutions, right?
Yeah. And before I let you go, I just maybe like 20 seconds, and you sparked the thought. Many folks are suggesting that Trump's presidency looks like the beginning of the decline of the American empire, right? And they come with parallels and data and all this sort of stuff to support this conclusion. Any thoughts on this idea that Donald Trump is fundamentally changing this country to where it will no longer be recognizable as indeed the American empire that we've come to know?
I'm going to just stick with sort of Black politics here and say, from the perspective of at least historical race relations, many Black people would laugh at that from the beginning and say that America was never the empire it says it was, right? That it's been a facade. This whole idea of the American dream has not been reachable for many Black people, for the entire history of the country. That this idea that the American empire is crumbling is really just a sense that the rest of the country is seeing what non-white groups, what minority groups have lived for most of their lives in America, right? And so from my perspective, at least, coming from someone who studies Black politics and researches the Black community and has these lived experiences, this idea of a crumbling empire is nothing new, right? It was bound to happen, considering how most people view their lives and their position in American politics and society day in and day out.
Yeah. Dr. Christopher Towler, I appreciate you every single time you take a moment to talk to us and to our listeners and educate us about the goings on in the country, having data-driven conversations, indeed doing the research. Before we let you go, please shout out your social media, ways folks can support you and keep in contact with all the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. You can follow me on social media. I, post analyses and things on X or Twitter at Black BLK PROF CCT, Black Prof CCT, and then definitely check out the research and analysis on the websites, www.blackvoterproject.com and www.blackinsightsresearch.com. Thanks so much for having me. Again, it's always a great conversation. Happy to talk about these important topics.
We appreciate you, sir.